Well, he began to think about this in the 40s when graduate students from China appeared in Cambridge, and one of the first things they asked Needham when they discovered that he was interested in Chinese science is, why didn't China have a scientific revolution like the West? He began to think about it then, but I think it's fair to say that Needham spent the rest of his life thinking about this question, and probably never came up with a completely satisfying answer, but I'm not sure that anybody will come up with a completely satisfying answer. One of the most interesting differences that emerges from an examination of the science that's being done in the scientific revolution and the kind of science and technology that was done in China, you could look at it just from the point of view of mathematics. The Chinese certainly had mathematics. They had a highly developed mathematics until the end of the Song dynasty. They were dealing with solutions to higher degree equations, simultaneous equations, and at least 4 unknowns. But they didn't develop the mathematics that could be applied to nature in the way that Galileo did, for example. And I think that there are multiple reasons for this that go back to Chinese philosophy, the social context, who was studying science in China, what was it being used for. Mathematics was used primarily by engineers, surveyors, and in astronomy for a very different kind of astronomy. In China, astronomy was basically algorithmic. You simply wanted to have some means of predicting when eclipses would occur, a means of setting up a calendar. But they didn't have a geometric model of the heavens. And whenever a new dynasty came along, it was usual to invent a new calendar. And whenever you did that, of course, you could sort of make up for the discrepancies that the inequalities of the lunar and the solar motions inevitably bring to any attempt to develop a single calendar once and for all. But with the Western geometric model, that's exactly what Ptolemy, since antiquity, had intended to do. And by the time we get to Copernicus, that system had broken down in a very obvious way. So the basic assumptions are quite different, and as a result, you get very different conclusions as to what the science that goes with it should be like. One of the things that is very much in the minds of the Chinese today is how to teach creativity. I spent last summer teaching a seminar at the University of Science and Technology of China in Hefei. A year before that, I was in Taiwan for an entire year on my sabbatical. Everywhere you went, the Chinese wanted to know how to teach creativity. And I said, well, you can't teach creativity by asking students to memorize material from books and then simply repeating it on examinations. Where does creativity in this interest come from in the West? I think again goes back to the time of the scientific revolution, the idea of Renaissance humanism, the emergence of the individual as an extremely important actor on the national and international stage. Whereas in China you have a completely different set of philosophical assumptions, whether you're looking at it from a Buddhist point of view or a Confucian point of view. But Confucianism in particular does not place a great deal of emphasis upon the individual. It's the family and the society as a unit. And everything is really subordinated to the interests of the family and to the society. And when that happens, you don't have a great deal of incentive from an individual point of view to make breakthroughs or make a name for yourself in the way that Renaissance humanism really invented the idea of the individual sort of taking responsibility for himself, making new ideas, coming up with a better mousetrap, all of which we take for granted. It's also related to ideas of Protestant religion. Merton's thesis was about radical Protestantism in England. He found out that the majority of the members of the Royal Society, it turns out, were radical dissenting Puritans. And that was a very interesting sociological insight into what made science what it was in England in the 17th century. And I think science studies is a fairly recent phenomenon, but I think it makes a lot of sense. Until the 50s and 60s, the history of science in the United States was basically what you'd call an internalist discipline, where people looked at the internal development of scientific ideas. Sometimes they wrote biographies, but the idea of really looking at science from multiple perspectives really didn't become a prominent approach to the history of science probably until the 70s or the 80s. The idea actually goes back to the thesis that R.K. Merton at Columbia University wrote, a kind of sociological analysis of science and technology in England in the 17th century. He published that in the late 1930s in Osiris, another journal founded by George Sarton. But I think science studies today really tries to look at science from multiple perspectives and multiple points of view. And that's one of the things that my seminar here at the Graduate Center does, looking at the scientific revolution, not just as an internal development of the scientific ideas, although that's certainly an important part of it, but looking at the biographies, the socioeconomic backgrounds, the contextual differences between science in China, for example, and science as it's developed in the West, all to give you a much richer understanding of what science is like, not just as a body of knowledge, but actually as a means of producing knowledge and the kinds of support systems that are necessary for the people that do it.